Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the second instalment of our two-part methylation series. If you were able to join me last week, you will already know me. My name is Anastasia. For those of you that are joining for the first time today, and I'm a clinician educator at Genova Diagnostics Europe, and I'm going to be taking you through today's webinar. So like last week, there will be a recording sent to you as well as the slides, but you will also find the slides in PDF format in the handout section on the control panel, also along with a support guide and a sample report for the methylation panel, as well as a fee schedule. So all of that information is there for you to download at your leisure. So, following on from our previous instalment of the series, today's aim is to go over Genova's methylation panel and its structure, as well as presenting on 2 case studies so that you go away with a deeper understanding of the value of the markers we test on the panel, and of course feel more confident in using it with your patients and clients. I recommend that if you didn't get a chance to listen in on the first webinar, that you do make some time to watch that, as that is essentially where I go into the bulk of the information with regards to the biomarkers and the various stages of the methylation cycle. So it essentially acts as a primer into the panel that we offer at Genova, as well as today's webinar. So today I'll be going systematically through the various sections of the test, starting off with the summary page at the beginning of the test, and then moving through the various sections such as the methylation balance ratios and what they mean for your patient, breaking down the biomarker pathways chart, and then finally moving into a couple of case studies where the test has been useful in elucidating certain health issues. Of course, there will always be question time at the end, so I'll leave 15 minutes at the end of the webinar, or at the end of the presentation, dedicated to your questions. So please do write your questions as we go along in the questions tab in the control panel. So before I dive into the various parts of the test, let's just start with a short intro into the test itself and an overview. So one of the key distinctions of Genova's methylation panel is that it combines both phenotypic and genotypic information in one profile. And what this means is that by measuring the functional analytes involved in the methylation cycle, as well as the genetic predispositions for altered enzymatic activity, this profile can help clinicians design more targeted treatment strategies to optimize patient outcomes. Essentially, clinicians are able to go beyond looking at genetic predispositions or SNPs, such as, for example, MTHFR, which I'm sure many of you already know about, or only measuring single biomarkers like homocysteine. And it's not to discredit those individual markers, as they of course still can give you some significant information, but there's often a lot more at play that's worth looking into. So just a bit of obvious sort of practical information, because this test combines both the genomic as well as the phenotypic markers. It does require both a buccal swab as well as a blood sample that needs to be centrifuged. I should also add that the genomic markers aren't automatically included in the test, they are an add-on. So of course, if your client or patient hasn't already done any genetic testing, I do recommend that they of course add that on, at least in the initial test, so that you can see how certain genetic variants can be at play amongst the functional analytes surrounding them. So we know that genotypic SNPs do not always translate to phenotypic expression. Genes can be switched on or off, and SNPs, they do represent genetic predispositions which aren't always clinically manifested, and that's why it's so important to test the functional analytes in addition to the SNPs. So if you're just testing the genes, you're largely playing a bit of a guessing game, and sort of guessing based on the clinical presentation of the patient or client whether or not those genes are playing out. So many of you, if not all of you, would have heard of the term, the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So ultimately, it's the factors in our environment, such as diet, lifestyle, and the quality of our relationships with our loved ones, like family, as well as our partners, that can influence our genetic expression. And on the methylation panel, if an enzymatic SNP is present, abnormal metabolites or functional analytes results near that enzyme may reflect an enzymatic SNP abnormality. So it gives you an insight as to whether that SNP is being expressed. So before I go on, I just wanted to give a brief explanation on the SNPs and what they actually are. So apologies if this is repeated information for some of you, as I'm sure many of you are already aware of what SNPs mean. So a SNP is essentially a single nucleotide polymorphism, and a SNP is the most common type of genetic variation amongst people. So each SNP represents a difference in a single nucleotide polymorphism, or single nucleotide, should I say, such as adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine in the genome sequence. You inherit two alleles or versions of each gene. One comes from your biological mother, and of course the other comes from your biological father. And if the alleles are identical, this means that you're homozygous for that specific gene. For example, you could have two alleles that for the gene that causes brown eyes. And then being heterozygous, of course, means you have two different alleles and you've inherited a different version from each parent. So here is an example of how we display the genes and the SNPs on the methylation panel. So as you can see, each enzyme evaluated will have two results representing each inherited allele, one from each parent. A plus sign indicates that a polymorphism has been detected, and the negative sign indicates that no SNP is present. So 2 plus signs highlighted in blue means that the patient has inherited two copies of that gene and is therefore homozygous, and 1 plus sign indicates heterozygous. No plus sign means that they have the wild type, which means that no polymorphisms have been detected on that gene. So you can also see that we display the genes in relation to the down-regulating or up-regulating impact that that particular SNP will have on that gene. And it's listed just there at the very top. So similar to other comprehensive Genova laboratory reports, the methylation panel results are displayed on the front page as a convenient visual summary of the test findings. And this page here is titled the Interpretation at a Glance page, and provides clinicians with a quick sort of overall methylation status assessment and separates the various aspects of the report into key clinical areas. This is also quite a useful sort of summary page which helps to facilitate the patient to, or the clinician to patient communication as to, where they want to draw the attention of where the sort of main imbalances may be occurring for that person. The first half of the page is displayed like this, with the three functional pillars to help separate the biomarkers into distinct categories. The methylation and the transsulfuration pillars on either side of the genetic polymorphism pillar capture the abnormal biomarkers. And these abnormal biomarkers are, of course, listed again on page 2 within their reference ranges. So the reason why we specifically just highlight the abnormal biomarkers here is related to an algorithm which provides a suspected degree of clinical impact. And that's, of course, referenced by the color coding system to indicate the severity of abnormality of the biomarkers. So this algorithm takes into consideration two factors, one of which is just how far out of reference range the biomarker is, and then the other factor is the clinical importance of that biomarker. So in the middle, we have the genomic polymorphism pillar, which provides the results of the genetic SNPs, which are an add-on to the methylation panel. And as you can see, the SNPs, as I mentioned in the previous slide, are categorized based on whether the polymorphism has a down-regulating impact on the activity of that enzyme or an up-regulating activity. Underneath the functional pillars on that same page is an overview assessment of the methylation status. The three indicators in the section include the SAM to SAR ratio at the very top. You've got the methylation balance ratio in the middle, and then you've got the met to sulf balance ratio at the bottom, which measures the ratio between the methylation, the methionine markers and the transsulfuration markers. So unlike the SAM to SAR ratio, which is commonly referred to in literature as the methylation index, the methylation balance ratio in the middle and the met to sulf balance ratio at the bottom are completely unique to Genova's methylation panel. So they are novel algorithms that were created by Genova to represent a broader attempt to capture functional disturbances within the methylation transsulfuration pathways by comparing multiple analytes related to those pathways. And I'll just go into detail about how each of these ratios work and what they can tell you about your client or patient. So as you may recall from the first webinar, global methylation is dependent on two key factors: adequate SAM supply and also adequate SAR removal. The SAM to SAR ratio has therefore been proposed to indicate the likelihood of hyper or hypomethylation. And as we also discussed in the last webinar, SAR, or S-adenosyl homocysteine, is a potent feedback inhibitor of methyltransferase reactions, which is why when SAR is elevated, it often leads to hypomethylation. And we also know that poor homocysteine clearance contributes significantly to SAR accumulation, which is of course another sign of hypomethylation. The methylation balance ratio compares 4 methylated metabolites, including SAM. As you can see, they are listed here, and also compares to 4 unmethylated metabolites listed here on the right-hand side. So the methylation balance ratio can be thought of as an expanded SAM to SAR ratio. And the clinical utility of the methylation balance ratio is that it represents a potential way to detect subtle methylation imbalance prior to alterations in the SAM to SAR ratio. So it's worth mentioning that, of course, this approach is still novel and is based on biochemical pathway analysis. However, early Genova data analysis of this biomarker has demonstrated its ability to distinguish a healthy cohort from an unqualified cohort. And of course, Genova will continue to conduct ongoing research on this novel biomarker's clinical application. The second calculated ratio is called the MET to methylation to transsulfuration balance ratio, and it compares analytes between the methylation pathway and the transsulfuration pathway. So there is a relative balance that exists between the methylation transsulfuration pathways, and this balance ensures that adequate levels of glutathione are produced to counteract oxidative stress, of course, and that an adequate level of SAM is made for methylation reactions. And you can see the ratios here in the middle that are used to compare the two analytes, the two sections, methylated metabolites and the unmethylated metabolites. So the second page of the report consists of the biomarker results, and as you can see, the biomarkers are groups based on their significance to the methylation panel. So you have the ratio section at the very top, the methyl group donors secondly, then methyl group metabolite, and then the transsulfuration metabolites at the bottom. The patient's results are listed in the first column and are either accompanied by an L or an H flag, if the results, of course, fall outside of the reference range. So just some very obvious information here. And biomarkers that are outside the reference range will appear under its corresponding pillar on the first page. So the biomarkers that are listed as either too high or too low are the ones that are on the first page in the pillars on the first half of that first page. And you will see them with a corresponding triangle pointing either upwards or downwards in yellow or red, depending on how far outside of the reference range they are. So finally, on page 3, we have the patient's biomarker results and their genomic results all displayed together in the pathway format. And it's quite helpful just to, when you're communicating to your client or patient the various imbalances that could be occurring, to use this page, because you get to look at it from a bird's eye point of view. So this really allows clinicians to visualize a patient's unique biochemistry based on their individual genomic and phenotypic results all in one place. So as you can see, the genomic results appear next to the enzymes that are evaluated and utilize the same sort of positive, negative abbreviates as on the first page. Any abnormal biomarkers appear with either a yellow or a red border, indicating either a borderline or abnormal finding, respectively. So this is really the overview of the panel and the structure of how the panel works. As you can see, you've also got a key just here. Oops, let me just go back. So you've got a key on the top right-hand side, which shows, how the enzyme is displayed, the cofactors as well, which are normally listed next to the arrows. And you've also got the genomic results, of course, in either plus or negative sign, depending on the SNP that they've inherited. So after that brief overview of the test and its structure, I'm going to move on to the case studies. And my aim with these is to demonstrate varying clinical presentations on the test and the various interventions that can be made to support imbalances. I won't go into too much detail on the therapeutic, so there isn't a huge amount of time, but I will go into detail into the biomarkers and what they could be telling us about the individual. So this is case study 1. This was a female patient with a 56-year-old patient. As you can see, her main health concerns were an anxiety/panic disorder. She also had a significant family history of cancer, both her maternal and paternal side of the family. So that was something that was on her mind as well, something she really wanted to look into preventing. She was also going through menopause as well. Her medications and therapies included HRT as well as hypnotherapy. And her most concerning symptoms were the anxiety, and that was coupled with low mood, brain fog, and panic attacks. She also suffered with cold extremities and intolerance to the cold, low blood pressure and dizziness, insomnia, and suspected sugar and addiction cravings. So I already mentioned she had a family history of cancer, and of particular concern to her was the breast cancer, which was on her maternal side of the family. She explained that she had anxiety since a young age, but it got significantly worse during her father's illness and subsequent passing later on in life. So moving on to her diet, this patient had a diet that was high in refined sugars, featured things like chocolate bars, ice cream, and cakes and sweets on a daily basis, quite low to moderate protein intake, and a lot of her meals were sort of very snacky, so they weren't very balanced in terms of their ratios between the various macronutrients. They often contained things like crackers, hummus, and pancakes. So she didn't really often cook herself a meal at lunchtime or breakfast. The only real sort of balanced meal in the day tended to be in the evening, which often included some sort of animal protein as well as some veg and some complex carbohydrates. So I had her do some initial labs and wanted to look at her homocysteine, as well as doing a comprehensive thyroid panel in relation to the symptoms around her thyroid. As you can see, her homocysteine was quite high, 15.57 UML per litre, and her comprehensive thyroid panel came back healthy. She did already have some hormone testing done through her GP, but it wasn't very comprehensive, so I did have that in mind as well as something to also look into. But methylation was one of the things that I wanted to look into first in relation to anxiety, as well as the cancer in her family. So we did the methylation panel, and this is a screenshot of the sort of first section on the interpretation at a glance page. And as you can see, she is trending towards hypomethylation, judging by the level of SAM, which is moderately low, as you can see, with the yellow triangle pointing down, and the level of SAR, which is moderately high. So you will recall that SAR inhibits methyltransferase enzymes, so will indicate hypomethylation, along with low levels of SAM. We can also see that many of her proteins are also quite low, which may also contribute to sort of global undermethylation. So for example, methionine, which you can see is listed on the left-hand side under methylation, is moderately low. And of course, methionine is a precursor to SAM. So this may lead to lower levels of SAM if methionine is low. And this was really sort of unsurprising considering her diet, which was very low in protein. I'm going to go into her SNPs in a second, but I just wanted to show you the initial sort of findings here. So I've inserted the SAM to SAR ratio screenshot from her test so that you can see what a typical picture of hypomethylation looks like. And below is a screenshot of how the SAR portion of the pathway layout page was shown. So I wanted to highlight this, as we know that what normally triggers a high SAR is an accumulation of homocysteine. And you can see that homocysteine in this particular test was healthy. And I've also inserted there a screenshot of where homocysteine lay within the reference range on this test. But because we had done that initial homocysteine test a month prior, we knew, I mean, at least I knew that her homocysteine was high, and that could have been contributing to her high homocysteine levels, her high SAR levels, apologies. So what I'm trying to say is that in a methylation panel, you may see sort of normal levels of homocysteine and elevated levels of SAR. And what this could indicate is that perhaps the homocysteine levels had previously been high and there was this sort of backup into SAR. So that's sort of what I wanted to highlight here. Because of that initial high homocysteine finding a month prior to doing a methylation panel, this is the sort of conclusion that I drew from this. So let's look at some of the genetics upstream in the folate cycle that may also be triggering hypomethylation. So as you can see at the top of the folate cycle, she has a heterozygous SNP on the SHMT gene, which regulates the availability of 5,10 methylene tetrahydrofolate to act as a substrate for MTHFR. And the impact of a SNP on this gene is downregulation. And one of the results of downregulation is, of course, a reduction in circulating levels of 5,10 methylene tetrahydrofolate and increased homocysteine as a result of that, because, of course, there may be less amounts of 5,10 MTHF as a result of that. In addition to the SHMT enzyme, as you can see, she also has two SNPs, heterozygous SNPs, on the MTHFR gene. Genova's panel detects the presence of both the C677T and the A1298C polymorphisms on MTHFR. And in this patient, she has a heterozygous SNP on each one, both triggering a downregulating impact on the activity of the enzyme. So you will recall that the MTHFR enzyme converts 5,10 methylene tetrahydrofolate to 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, and this step activates folate to be used for homocysteine conversion to methionine, meaning that if these SNPs are being expressed, this leaves less methylfolate available to convert homocysteine to methionine. As you can see, there is some explanation on the impact that either one of the SNPs can have on the left-hand side. So research shows that a heterozygous SNP on the C677T polymorphism can result in downregulation. However, a heterozygous SNP on the A1298C polymorphism is unlikely to, but if someone has combined heterozygosity for both those two polymorphisms, this can result in significant plasma homocysteine elevation. And this is exactly what this patient has. And despite the fact that her homocysteine levels are normal in this particular test, we can assume from the elevated SAR that the previously high homocysteine may be stimulating the SAR accumulation. So now let's look at the SNPs related to B12 metabolism and the role that they could further play in limiting homocysteine to methionine conversion. So as you can see, she has a heterozygous SNP on the MTR enzyme, which has an upregulating effect on the activity of the enzyme. And this enzyme is responsible for the conversion of homocysteine to methionine. So we may assume healthier methionine levels if that SNP was to be being expressed. The MTRR enzyme also has a heterozygous polymorphism on it, and that has a downregulating impact on the activity of the enzyme. MTRR is responsible for reducing oxidized forms of B12 to be reused, and that essentially regulates the availability of methylated B12 to convert homocysteine to methionine in addition to methylfolate. So again, we can assume that this would lead to an elevation of homocysteine, which isn't the case in this particular test, but again, because of the high SAR, it may be that the homocysteine, the higher homocysteine previously was in fact contributing to that, the high SAR levels and hypomethylation. So finally, we get to the methionine adenylyl transferase enzyme, MAT, which is shown there with the arrow. The MAT enzyme is highly conserved and regulated. It's responsible for converting methionine to SAM, and this SNP downregulates the enzyme's activity, which decreases SAM production. As you can see, the availability of cofactor nutrients like magnesium and potassium, as well as the compound ATP, are necessary for the MAT enzyme to function properly. So, of course, regulating the availability of these compounds and nutrients was essential. We also know that this enzyme is further downregulated by oxidative stress. And as you can see, her glutathione is low, and we know that glutathione is the body's most potent intracellular antioxidant and is able to scavenge free radicals as well as acting as a detoxifying agent. So her oxidative stress was potentially high because her glutathione was low, and that could have been having an impact on the functioning of that enzyme. In addition to having a SNP which has a downregulating impact on that enzyme. In addition, you can also see that cysteine was also moderately low, and the availability of cysteine is known to be rate limiting for glutathione synthesis. So this could be further contributing to her low glutathione levels. So there are some other factors that could have been impeding her glutathione biosynthesis. As you can see, her cystathionine is elevated here, and cystathionine is a dipeptide which is then converted to cysteine via the enzyme CTH. You can see that there in the middle of the arrow. And because cystathionine is an intermediate of the transsulfuration pathway, an elevation of this biomarker in addition to low levels of cysteine, which is what's happening here, may indicate a backup in the transsulfuration pathway. Conversion of cystathionine to glutathione requires necessary cofactors such as B6, as you can see is illustrated there next to the arrow. But there are also other cofactors like zinc and glycine, as well as magnesium. And so therefore transient elevations of this metabolite, cystathionine, may indicate an increased need for these cofactors. And as you can see, there is quite clearly a backup going on here. So cysteine, is a non-essential sulfur-containing amino acid. It can be obtained either from the diet as well as being endogenously made from cystathionine. So as mentioned in the previous slide, of course, it is a very important component of glutathione, and it has been shown to be the limiting amino acid for glutathione synthesis. And the conversion from cysteine to glutathione requires the enzyme glutathione synthetase, or GSS. And this is the same enzyme that also catalyzes the conversion of glycine to glutathione. And as you can see, glycine is quite significantly elevated, which suggests to me that potentially there is also a backup going on here within this enzyme. And it's interesting because this is the same enzyme this enzyme also requires B6. So there could be, you know, an elevated need for B6 as a result of this. Now, as you will recall, this client's chief health concern was her anxiety and panic disorder, which is why having the COMT gene included in the methylation panel is so incredibly useful. So the COMT gene is not displayed in the biomarker layout page. However, it is tested because it plays a key role in phase 2 detoxification of estrogens, as well as the deactivation of catecholamines such as dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. Of course, you can see with, you know, one of the cofactors of the COMT enzyme is SAM. So having adequate levels of SAM produced through the methionine cycle is essential for the activity of COMT. So this patient had low levels of SAM, and as you can also see, she has a homozygous SNP on the COMT gene, which means that there is most likely a downregulation in the activity of this enzyme, leading to a backup in catecholamines, as well as estrogens. So this could be why she suffered with such a terrible anxiety disorder. And because of her other chief health concern was preventing breast cancer, this was also useful, as we know that having prolonged estrogen exposure can increase the risk of breast cancer. This client was also on HRT, so it made it even more important to know her risk and potentially go on to do some hormone testing to see how well she is metabolizing the HRT. So with that in mind, I know this is going sort of outside the methylation panel, but because of her family history, I wanted to check her hormone metabolism. And as you can see, her parent estrogens, the estrone and the estradiol, are very high, which is unsurprising as she is on HRT. But what I'm concerned with is A, which pathways is she methylating, or sorry, which pathways is she metabolizing her estrogens in phase 1? And B, how well is she methylating her estrogens? So as you can see, she's quite elevated on all 3 phase 1 pathways. So you can see the 2-hydroxy, the 16-alpha hydroxy, and the 4-hydroxy are all elevated. But what we never want to see is higher than normal levels of the 4-hydroxy pathway or metabolite, as this metabolite has the greatest estrogenic and genotoxic potential of all 3. And we know that 4-hydroxy metabolites may induce DNA damage, which generates reactive oxygen species. And this is especially the case if it doesn't go through phase 2 detox methylation as well as it could be. And as you can see, if you look at the arrow from the 4-hydroxy to the 4-methoxy metabolite, which is, as you can see, metabolized through the COMT enzyme, this is exactly what is occurring to her. Her 4-hydroxy is at 6.1 and her 4-methoxy is below detectable levels, which suggests to me that this COMT, the homozygous SNP on her COMT gene was playing out in real time. So she's not methylating her estrogens very well. So why is this so important in the context of the methylation panel? Aside from affirming that her COMT SNP is indeed most likely being expressed when looking at her poor estrogen methylation and anxiety disorder, we also know that her glutathione is low. And of course, glutathione is a key antioxidant for reducing the toxicity of the quinones and the reactive oxygen species generated by poorly methylated 4-hydroxy metabolites. So having low glutathione means she's at a higher risk of DNA damage and therefore breast cancer. So here were my interventions. Now, one of the key tricky sort of things with this particular client is that she was incredibly sensitive to B vitamins. She had already, been on a journey of trying to find solutions for her anxiety. She was very well versed in supplements, and she had already tried B vitamins in various different levels, liquid as well as capsules, and she always felt incredibly anxious after taking them. So this is quite a common thing when it comes to people with anxiety disorders. And what I have found is that because obviously methylation plays such an important role in detoxification processes, if there are high levels of toxicity, such as, for example, an accumulation of steroid hormones, potentially environmental toxicants, and then we then start supplying the person with high levels of methylfolate and methyl B12 without dealing with other aspects of detox pathways, this can lead to an increase in symptoms, and that does include anxiety as well as other issues. So I didn't obviously recommend methylated Bs. I didn't think obviously it's worth trying that. So my aim was really to instead focus on dietary approaches. So here, you know, as you can see, some of the dietary changes. So increasing her green leafy veg with the folate, increasing fiber, especially the cruciferous family of vegetables for obvious reasons, you know, supporting the estrogen detox pathways, improving her protein intake because it was so low, and reducing the high glycemic load intake of, you know, the foods that were high in sugar. She also was happy to have liver on a weekly basis, so she started having that, and of course that's really important nutrient for choline as well as B vitamins. So these are unlikely to have such an impact on her anxiety, and will help to provide the raw materials there without going in with such sort of concentrated doses. So I also worked on other aspects of methylation. I did sort of provide her with a complex that contains choline and betaine, which is, you know, helps with the salvage pathway of homocysteine to methionine conversion, obviously gentler as well. B6 was obviously a very important nutrient for hers. I did suspect that there was some depletion going on there because of the backups in the transsulfuration pathway. And then, of course, liposomal glutathione as well as NAC. I did give her some botanicals as well in relation to her estrogen detox pathways, and magnesium as well to support the COMT enzyme, as well as, you know, helping with the anxiety. So this client is ongoing, as is the second case study as well. So she has seen quite a significant improvement. However, it's still very much ongoing, as I'm sure many of you can, you know, appreciate. These things do take time, and not overnight things. But we are in that process, and I do believe that this approach is far more gentle than putting in the methylated B vitamins from the get-go. So let's move on to the second case study. I'm just aware of time, so I don't want to run out of time here. So this was a client, a male client, this time aged 44. Again, his main concerns were anxiety disorder, as well as OCD, depression, and obesity. He was on anafranil, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, and had been on that for many years, and I think at least 20 years. He had been seeing a somatic experiencing therapist to help support him with some trauma that he had experienced in his life. His most concerning symptoms were social anxiety, brain fog, low mood, hyperactivity, and an interesting thing which I've only come across a couple of times in my time as a clinician, which was post-orgasm illness syndrome. So he was very, very sensitive to the days sort of following intimacy with his partner. He said he felt very unwell, felt very down, and so that was something else that, you know, was quite an interesting part of his clinical presentation. He did have a high intake of alcohol. It really helped him to relax. Sugar cravings, insomnia, I already mentioned obesity. And in terms of his family history, there was some significant history there, at least in terms of his, you know, mental health on his maternal side. So he explained to me that when his mother was pregnant with him, she suffered with very severe depression, and she had some quite invasive therapy at the time. The most pivotal life stage for him, when he remembers his mental health really taking a turn for the worse, was during university, where he began binge drinking and was in a very toxic relationship. And it was at this moment that he started taking antidepressants, which he said at the time were a lifesaver. He also has a lot of stress in his environment, which I haven't mentioned here. He has 2 sons that have autism, one of which is quite severe and is non-verbal. So those were very significant factors in his stress. So in terms of his diet, he very much described himself as an emotional eater. He goes through these cycles of restriction and binging very frequently. Massive snacker, so he tends to sort of restrict on the main meals and end up snacking around meals on things like crisps, fruits, nuts, and biscuits. In his restriction phase, he would stick to things like chicken salads and salmon salads, which he would actually buy ready-made from places like Marks and Spencer's. He would buy a packet of chicken fillets, sliced fillets or salmon, cooked salmon, and then a salad separately, which wouldn't contain very much, things like just salad leaves and tomatoes, nothing, no sort of fats, no complex carbohydrates in there. Fruit and walnuts he would often have for breakfast, and that's it. In his binge phase, he would go through a phase of, very high intake of alcohol, cakes, pizza, crisps, high coffee intake as well on a general sort of basis. So quite a lot of things to change there. So here were his methylation test results. So this patient's test results, as you can see, were quite interesting. Whilst his homocysteine was significantly low, his SAR was very high. We would normally expect to see homocysteine elevated in addition to SAR, or at least normal. So this was an interesting finding. But in any case, we know that, of course, high levels of SAR in and of itself is very inhibitory to methyltransferase enzymes. And if we very quickly look at the COMT SNP, he is also homozygous here. So again, we have another case where chronic anxiety is potentially being impacted by having a homozygous SNP on the COMT gene, being additionally downregulated by high levels of SAR. And this here is just to highlight this. So whilst his SAM levels were good, as you can see, well within the reference range, I've provided a screenshot there. Because his SAR is so high, the SAM to SAR ratio is also low, which indicates hypomethylation. And I've added a screenshot at the bottom here on some of the factors that you can that can be employed when the SAM to SAR ratio is low, and that you'll find that, by the way, in the support guide. So you may recall in the previous webinar I spoke about how the complex interplay between the availability of methyl donors and the activity of the enzymes are constantly trying to find a balancing act to prevent hypo or hypermethylation. Here is an example of that. So whilst there are low levels of homocysteine, which we've seen on previous slides, and an unsurprisingly low level of methionine, and in addition to that, you have a SNP on the MAT enzyme, which would normally downregulate the conversion of methionine to SAM. Despite all of those factors, there are still healthy levels of SAM. And this really drives home the point that it is essential to not only test genes, but also test the functional analytes to see how those genes are playing out in real time. So despite all of those factors, there are some compensatory mechanisms that help to keep things in balance, and this is what's playing out for him. His SAM levels are healthy despite the fact that all of those other factors are would normally lead to lower SAM levels. So there is a relative balance that exists between methylation and transsulfuration pathways, and I've mentioned before, this is really to ensure that there are adequate levels of glutathione to counteract oxidative stress, as well as ensure an adequate level of SAM is made for methylation reactions. So in the presence of oxidative stress, more homocysteine is used for glutathione production because oxidative stress induces enzymes in the transsulfuration pathway. And as you can see, this could be the case for this patient. His glutathione levels are very low, and whilst his homocysteine is also low, his cystathionine levels are healthy. And this is potentially giving me an insight here into, could the transsulfuration pathway be being upregulated and shunting that homocysteine down that pathway in order to address the low levels of glutathione? So again, with this particular patient, you can see that there is a potential backup going on there. His cystathionine, his glycine, and his cysteine are all healthy, but his glutathione is incredibly low. So potentially there could be a lack of availability of those cofactor nutrients like B6, as well as the other factors that I mentioned previously, that could be preventing the conversion of cysteine and glycine to glutathione. So B6 was a key nutrient for him as well. So one of the things that I really wanted to look into was why his SAR levels were so high, and particularly because his homocysteine levels were so low. So there are a couple of things. We know that his alcohol consumption was very, very high. And in my research, I found that chronic alcohol consumption in mice at least increased intracellular levels of SAR quite significantly by impairing the methionine cycle. And we can also see that B3 is a cofactor nutrient for the enzyme responsible for the hydrolysis of SAR to homocysteine. And B3, as I'm sure many of you already know, is used to form nicotinamide coenzyme, or NAD. And that is really essential for supporting redox reactions that are important for mitigating oxidative stress. So interestingly also, NAD is an important coenzyme of the glutathione reductase enzyme, which converts oxidized glutathione to its reduced form. And alcohol can deplete B3 and the pool of NAD. So there seemed to be this vicious cycle of alcohol increasing SAR and depleting B3, as well as potentially driving low glutathione, which was increasing his oxidative stress levels. And there were also obviously other factors going on there: the stress, the trauma he'd experienced in his life, his diet, which could have also been contributing to the depletion in his glutathione. So just very quickly, we did do some other labs with this patient. So he did some mineral testing. Selenium, as you can see at the very bottom, was very low, which is an essential cofactor in glutathione biosynthesis. Magnesium is a cofactor for COMT, and whilst he isn't deficient, he was sort of on the lower end of that reference range. As you can see, his zinc was high, and he was already supplementing with zinc, so we did lighten the load on that. And lastly, the potassium was low, and of course that is a cofactor for the MAT enzyme that catalyzes methionine to SAM. But I wasn't overly concerned about that, as there was no sign that that was impacting the activity of that enzyme. But I did suspect that his high alcohol and coffee intake may be depleting his potassium levels. So here are my interventions. Because of his susceptibility to emotional eating, cravings, and binging, my first priority was to balance his blood sugar levels. And I suspected that in his restriction phases, the carbohydrate and fat avoidance was fueling high adrenaline levels and an overstimulation of his limbic brain. So it was very important to introduce complex carbohydrates in addition to increasing his protein and healthy fats. And my hope was that by doing this, we would be able to, send sort of messages of safety to his nervous system. Of course, I also removed alcohol and caffeine as much as possible, given the fact that obviously there's a huge component of his psychology that was impacting his sort of cycle in all of this. But I did offer him some alternatives to help replace those things with other healthier, options. I had also read into the post-orgasm illness syndrome, and one of my takeaways was the possibility of opioid withdrawal having an impact on his brain in the days following intimacy with his partner. And the suggestion was to introduce consistent exercise into his routine to support the balance of opioids in his brain. So he really enjoyed walking and running, so he started incorporating that on a daily basis. We worked on a gentle introduction of B vitamins. He wasn't sensitive to B vitamins, so that was great. Additional B3 on its own, as well as glutathione support through NAC, liposomal glutathione, and selenium. I also added magnesium to support the MAT enzyme. And his improvement was pretty dramatic, but what kept sort of stalling his progress was the psychology around food. And so he had been in this vicious cycle of binging and restriction for such a long time that at this point it was important to have him be referred to a therapist that could deal with a potential eating disorder that was at play here. But in general, things really did improve, and it still is an ongoing case. We haven't done a follow-up methylation panel, but that is on the cards at some point. So apologies for going over time there. As you can imagine, a lot of information to get through. So I'm going to start looking at your questions. Please do start writing them, if you haven't already, in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. As always, if you have any other further questions that won't be answered today or that you want to answer questions separately, you can get in touch with us through the email provided there, clineduk@gdx.net. Any feedback as well is really, really appreciated. So let's have a look at the questions. Okay. So Tara is asking, is the inability to metabolize caffeine, medications, and sensitivity to alcohol indicative of a methylation issue? So yes, potentially. So any sort of questionable detox processes or signs of questionable detoxification can be indicative of poor methylation. So many of the methyltransferase enzymes are related to detox pathways. And so therefore, if there is hypomethylation going on, then there will be less SAM available to, for as a cofactor for those methyltransferase enzymes, and therefore potentially that can lead to poor detox pathways, particularly in relation to things like medications, alcohol, and also potentially caffeine. So yes, absolutely. Really, really great question here. So should the client stop taking supplements prior to the test for how many days? So I guess this depends on what you're wanting to look for. So if you're wanting to see whether the supplement program that you have provided for your client is supporting them, then you may want to keep them on that supplement program. If you previously tested the client's homocysteine levels, for example, and know that they were really high, and you want to check again to see whether the B vitamins that you're supplying them with are supporting the homocysteine, as well as other pathways like SAM production, for example, then you may want to keep them on that supplementation program. But if you're wanting a baseline sort of level of baseline reading, then of course you do want to stop them taking their supplements, and I would recommend stopping them for 4 to 5 days, up to a week potentially, prior to taking the blood sample. Okay, so this is a great question by Madeline. Had you not done the homocysteine test 1 month prior, would you be mistaken then into thinking homocysteine was not elevated? We can assume that if SAR levels are elevated, at some point the homocysteine may have also been elevated, because the most significant driver of high SAR is an elevation in homocysteine and a backup in that pathway. So yeah, I would just sort of, if you do see healthy levels of homocysteine, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've always been healthy, basically. And I guess this sort of drives home the point that it's important not just to test homocysteine, and SAR really is, as I keep saying over and over again, its pathogenicity lies in the inhibition of methyltransferase enzymes. So ultimately, we depend on SAR removal to support methylation. So this is why it's really important to test SAR. But yeah, so high levels of SAR normally are indicative of previously high levels of homocysteine if they're not currently high in that particular test. I've got a question here by Paul. So quercetin is rapidly metabolized by COMT and increases SAR. Would you avoid it as well as luteolone? To be honest, Paul, I haven't come across that. I didn't realize that quercetin can increase SAR. So this is completely new to me, I'll be very honest with you. But if that's the research that you've done and you've established that, then I would say, of course, remove that prior to doing a test, because it may therefore lead to discrepancies in the test results. Maha is asking a question, why liver versus eggs for the choline? So eggs as well, by the way, I didn't put that in the slide, but she also increased in her egg intake. So eggs, of course, are really concentrated source of choline, but the liver in particular, I think because of the other nutrients in there, like the B vitamins, the bioavailability of those B vitamins in liver is so great that I wanted to add that in as well. But I didn't exclusively just say liver. Eggs were also an elevation for her in her diet. So Paul is asking, when someone is sensitive to methyl B, what are your thoughts on using folinic acid? So folinic acid is an excellent alternative. In her case, she was still sensitive to that, so she's a particularly sensitive client, but it is or has been recommended as an alternative to methylfolate because it has more of a gentle impact. What's great about folinic acid is that it bypasses the DHFR enzyme, so it doesn't need to be activated by that enzyme to enter the folate cycle. And it is readily used to create 5-MTHF. So I do think that there's a great, option for those that are sensitive. But with this particular client, she was so sensitive that even using folinic acid was not good for her. So Paul is asking again, what would you want to look at SNPs on the VDR gene when you have homozygous COMT? Potentially, yeah. So VDR, as I believe it to be important, is in relation to the activation of certain neurotransmitters. So it could be significant in relation to COMT. But I'm, to be honest, not sure in what sort of angle that you're looking at, whether that would be a negative thing or not to have SNPs on VDR in relation to homozygous COMT. Okay. So Elena is asking about hypermethylation. So that is something that can be established from the test as well, of course. And you would see that on the SAM to SAR ratio. You would obviously see that on the upper end of that scale. I didn't have any case studies that were demonstrating hypermethylation. And to be honest, in all the methylation panels that I've done, I've actually never seen that before. So I do believe that it's much more infrequent than looking at hypomethylation pictures, but it can be established by the test, and of course you would, in that circumstance, you would see an elevation in SAM. So that's how you would see that represented on the test. So let's see. So Claire Thompson is asking if I can touch on potassium as a cofactor a little bit more. So potassium is a cofactor for the MAT enzyme, which is the enzyme that is responsible for converting methionine to SAM. It's listed there in that pathway in the biomarker layout page. You can see the cofactors next to the MAT enzyme, one of which is potassium. So that's why we're sort of touching on that. But because his SAM levels were really healthy, despite the fact that he had low methionine as well as a SNP on the MAT enzyme and low potassium, it wasn't really something that I was overly worried about. Do I have a preferred type of magnesium to support methylation? Question by Maha. So I think, and I don't know whether other clinicians feel this way, but I believe magnesium bisglycinate to be the magnesium to be used in this situation for methylation. I tend to use other types of magnesium for other presentations. For example, if someone has a lot of anxiety, then sometimes I may also give magnesium L-threonate or magnesium taurate. But in general, with methylation, I'd say magnesium bisglycinate or glycinate should be a good option. Correct me if I'm wrong. So Tonya was asking why there aren't any gut tests in the case studies. So this is a methylation webinar, so this is why we're exclusively looking at methylation panels here. I did branch out a little bit with one of the case studies in relation to estrogen detoxification, because of the fact that that particular case study with homozygous COMT SNP and having had breast cancer in her family, I wanted to check, the estrogen detox pathways, but we don't have much time, and so going completely out there and taking the focus away from methylation was obviously not a priority. Rebecca Hughes is asking, was she so sensitive to the B vitamins because she had high heavy metals or toxins? So I didn't test heavy metals. I didn't test for other toxins. It could be, though, that she did have high levels of environmental toxins. We know that oxidative stress can have a negative impact on the COMT gene, and she had very low levels of glutathione. She did have a sort of an accumulation of steroid hormones, as you will remember, and one of which, of course, is the elevation in the 4-hydroxy metabolite, which is quite damaging to DNA and also increases oxidative stress. So that, for me, was a sign that there was increased toxicity, at least from that point of view. But no, I didn't do any testing on heavy metals. Fakira is asking what percentage of functionality is affected by a downregulated homozygous SNP. That's a very difficult question to answer because it very much depends on the SNP, on the gene, should I say. It also depends on the patient and their presentation, as well as the functional analytes surrounding that SNP. So it's a very difficult question to answer with a black and white response. I would just drive home the importance of, again, testing the SNPs in relation to the analytes, as well as piecing that up with the clinical presentation and sort of really just using your skills as a clinician to understand what could be playing out, based on the symptoms. So I'll just answer a couple more questions. Kim is asking, was he snacking a lot to be so overweight on what you describe as his diet? So I wouldn't say that just the snacking was causing his weight gain. I do believe it was the sort of binge and restrict cycle. When he was binging, he really was binging, like he was going all out. He was going all out on the alcohol as well as the processed foods, and so I think that was in large part what was contributing to his weight gain. I should also add that there was genetic factors as well. On his paternal side of the family, there was quite a lot of obesity there, so there was also that side of things too. Deb is asking whether homocysteine can fall through the plug hole into transsulfuration pathway, making it a potential unreliable measure in isolation. So yeah, potentially. I mean, I guess with the second case study, I guess his was very low, so that could be a sign that it's going, overly going down the transsulfuration pathway to meet his glutathione needs. So yeah, I guess I do agree with you. I think that just testing homocysteine in isolation, it can be useful in some circumstances. Of course, that is actually what drove me into doing the methylation panel for the first case study, because hers was so high. But I do think it is important to test other factors rather than just doing the homocysteine test. So yes, that is important. Okay, just one more question. So does the methylation test include the SNPs? So I think I mentioned this already at the beginning of the presentation. The methylation panel includes the SNPs as an add-on, so they're not automatically included. You'll need to add them onto the panel, and I explained that if your client or patient hasn't done any genetic testing in methylation, that it is really important that they do that in addition to the functional analyze, at least in the first test. Of course, you won't need to test the genes again, but it is important that you do add that on in the first test at least. So no, it doesn't. It's not automatically included, but it is an add-on option. Okay, I think I will leave it there. I'm sorry if I haven't managed to get to your question. There are so many different aspects of methylation that are just you know, so interesting, and it's a very complex topic. So I hope that has helped to some extent into, you know, highlighting the main points and helping you, you know, to understand how it can be valid for your clinical practice. If you have any further questions, again, please do email us, feedback as well. I will be sending the recording to you today later on in case you want to watch over it again. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing some of you soon in some future webinars.